Thanks. Okay, so I know you're bracing yourself, a damn college professor with a PhD who can barely row a boat. What could he possibly tell us? Let's see what happens. Here's sort of the short story and the message of what I'm going to talk about. We've been on this long river trip. Started somewhere in the mid-1800s, at least from the perspective of European occupation of the West, with the first diversions of water in the upper basin. It's been more than a century since water was diverted into the Imperial Valley at the lower end of the basin. We've had this crazy dysfunctional river trip. People on this river trip all together have completely different ideas on how we should experience this river trip. And we've begun to hear these distant sort of, I'm not sure how the metaphor would work, that we would get the information, but we've heard that the river is somehow fundamentally changing in a dangerous and scary way, related to climate change and increasing consumptive use. And we've come around the bend and we've pulled the boats over and we're looking at what is surely an unrunnable cascade. That is, there is no way we can get through this, except that the walls are unscalable. We've got to run this together no matter how much we don't like each other. And we're going to have to get through because there is no other option. And what I want to describe a little bit is a little bit of the journey to get to this place, and then a little bit of just how unrunnable this run looks. And I'm not smart enough to know what is the run. Thankfully, there are amazing and competent boatmen amongst you and everyone else on this river trip in other hallways of power and influence. We're going to figure a way through this. My only point here is to say that the west of John Wesley Powell's era was a very different place. Utah and New Mexico in 1870 were the most extensively populated areas in the West. The U.S. Census recorded less than 10,000 people in Arizona. Today's Colorado River is a completely different place. The oft-quoted number is 40 million people dependent on the river. And what I want to point out, importantly for the fate of the river, is that large areas of consumptive use shown in red hatchers are outside the watershed, which means to serve any of those areas, you physically extract water out of the watershed. We know that the big users are Southern California, the Imperial Valley, the Mexicali Valley, and the Yuma Irrigation District, the Central Arizona Project Canal going to Phoenix and Tucson. I should note that somewhere in the vicinity of 80 or 90% of the green vegetables consumed in the United States and Canada between November and April is grown here. The other point is that although there is certainly significant agricultural use in the upper basin, all of the municipalities that are dependent on water in the upper basin are outside of the watershed, which means that use of water for the growing urban areas of the upper basin means extracting more water out of the watershed. It's its own talk to explain the convoluted array of compacts, international treaties, Supreme Court rulings, legislation that has led to what we call the law of the river. I do want to point out that the world of the 1920s, when the compact was negotiated, was a somewhat different world. It was starting to change. Colorado's population then was twice what it was in Utah. Arizona's population had significantly increased. And this array of priorities, with the most important priority to the least important priority, is a result of this hodgepodge of laws and Supreme Court rulings and everything else. Very little of this comes directly out of the Colorado River Compact. But what is important is that anyone who was using water in the watershed prior to the compact has rights to use all of that use. And so importantly, there are 3 million acre feet of water in the state of California that date to before the compact. And those rights are senior to anything else. And then, as many of you are familiar, the lower basin has a somewhat higher priority than the upper basin. These are fixed amounts to California, Nevada, and Arizona. And then the upper basin proportionally divides what's left over. Now, the reality is that at the time it was negotiated, the negotiators assumed there was such an abundant amount of water that they would also get 7.5 million acre feet to divide. The reason why it becomes percentages is these percentages were agreed on in the 1940s, after it began to be realized that there was less water in the system. The way this plays out, to use Utah as an example, is that Utah has rights to 23% of the upper basin share. But the absolute amount of water that Utah has available depends on how big the pie is. And how big the pie is depends on what the natural runoff of the basin is minus what is delivered to the lower basin. And so anytime we talk in Utah about Utah has X amount of undeveloped water, that is not true. There is no fixed amount. The amount available to be developed depends on how big the pie is. Now, we could talk ad nauseum about the effects of dams and fragmenting the ecosystem, trapping sediment, diversions, dewater streams. We're all familiar with how the flow regime of the Colorado River and Grand Canyon has changed. I'm not going to talk about any of that. But I am going to talk about one ecosystem driver, which is the temperature of the water. Now, the traditional view of the Colorado River and Grand Canyon is that it's a cold water, that your ankles tingle when you're rigging a boat at Lee's Ferry. And that's because when the reservoir is full, in summer, the reservoir stratifies. You're water skiing, jumping off of houseboats up in Lake Powell, but the water released downstream is cold because it's well below that warm layer. But as Lake Powell drops in storage, because the withdrawal point is fixed in elevation, now the temperatures of water being released downstream are much warmer. And as Powell gets lower, the release temperatures into Grand Canyon will continue to get warmer. Now, the coloring here is sort of, fits with our image of the average temperature when reservoirs were full, scaled this way, with blue being cold water, Grand Canyon being unusually cold in relationship to how warm the green and the upper Colorado are, tailwaters below Navajo, tailwater below Flaming Gorge. And these stars are just the degree to which every one of these stars is filled in is the degree to which there's a big population, a low population, or no population of any of these species. These three species are three representative native fish of the watershed. And the message here is I've circled where parts of the river where these species once lived and now they're extirpated or barely exist. These two warm water, non-native competitors and predators of native fish are abundant in some parts of the upper basin. Cold water, non-native rainbow trout are abundant and desired at least in the headwaters below Flaming Gorge and Fontenelle and below Glen Canyon. And we're aware that there is this one refuge population of one native species, the humpback chub, in Grand Canyon. Now, the point for showing this, and I'm just going to say it, is that there's no going back to the old days. The ecosystems of every part of the Colorado River system are novel assemblages of native and non-native species. We could do the same thing for riparian vegetation. There's no going back. And the other point is that on this crazy river trip in which we haven't gotten along, we don't disagree about what the values and importance of different aspects of the river are. And there are people who care desperately about non-native trout and the maintenance of those fisheries, and people who care desperately about the quality of bass fishing on reservoirs. And we're going to have to work it out. But just don't think that everybody agrees with you. And the scary thing about all this is that means we have to play God. We have to decide what we want. And that's a scary thing. It isn't just so simple to say, oh, we want to go back to the black and white photos of 1872. Now, the one main point of the Colorado River system right now is that the system is completely tapped. Not a drop makes it to the Sea of Cortez. That means any change in this balance is going to cause great heartbreak, right? Because nothing gets out now. I understand this is a different kind of a talk with numbers and graphs, and I know you're all smart, so I'm going to try to cut to the chase here. If you go through all the recent data of how much water is consumptively used and evaporated in the basin, and you look at the averages of every year reported by Reclamation since the year 2000, the total consumptive uses and losses in the whole basin from the main stem river are 15 million acre feet a year. 15 million acre feet a year is a number like 21,000 cubic feet per second. That's how much water is used. But keep that number 15 in your mind. In the lower basin, on average, releases out of Davis Dam have been about 9.5 million acre feet. There might be somebody in the room who sort of has committed to memory that releases in Glen Canyon Dam are 8.23 million acre feet. Well, the reality is that Glen Canyon Dam has been releasing consistently more than 8.23 for the entire 21st century. And then there's about 700,000 acre feet of water that comes in within the Grand Canyon. 9.5 million acre feet is a number like 13,000 CFS. That number keeps decreasing. Central Arizona Project, Colorado River Aqueduct, Imperial Valley, All-American Canal, Mexicali, zero gets through. This is the part of the river that's a river no more, the book Philip Fradkin wrote in the 70s. So in the lower basin, every drop of water is used. Maybe used wastefully, but it's used. In the upper basin, The upper basin, remember, thought they'd cut a deal that they would also get to use 7.5 million acre feet of water. To date, after more than a century of a chance to develop and use that water, the average use rate is about 3.6 million acre feet plus evaporation. Maybe that number is 4, but that number is not 7.5. And therein lies the debate going forward if you read newspapers about how negotiations are going on. It's that the lower basin is looking at what do they do when they're using every drop of water and Mexico is using every drop of water. And the upper basin is trying to hold on to the aspiration that someday in the future they'll use water. And what I've also shown on this plot is these are all the projections. And you know, this is when this was once made, this was the future, this is what it turned out. This is a projection, this is what it turns out. Every time you're told it's going to be we're going to grow, we need to build more infrastructure because it is inevitable. The reality is it's never been inevitable. Since the late 80s, upper basin uses have been about the same. Remember, 15 million is sort of the rough number of what we use today. The average flow of the river between 1930 and 1999 was 14. Those are in balance because we weren't using 15 million acre feet in the middle of the 20th century. Unfortunately, when the compact was negotiated, the average flow of the river was 17.9 million acre feet. And since 2000, the flow of the river has been 12.7 million acre feet. That's a problem because the numbers of 15 million are the averages since 2000. How is it possible to have more water used than water comes in? By draining the bank account. And Powell and Meade are both only 30% full. But now we've spent the bank account. The projections of elevations in Meade and Powell in the next 2 years include reasonable projections that Powell is going to go below minimum power plant capacity and even higher likelihood of Meade. Reclamation next day or two is going to release new projections based on the October modeling, and these will all surely get even worse. You'll read about it in the newspapers. Remember, when you release water from a low reservoir, the release temperatures are warmer. Remember? This is the temperature regime at Lee's Ferry. Nobody's going to have trouble knowing when Glen Canyon Dam was completed. It did take a while for these oscillations to begin to dampen down because Powell needed to fill. The projections for 2020, this should be 22 and that should be 23. I'm sorry. The next 2 years are unprecedented in the history of Colorado River post Glen Canyon Dam. The river is going to get much, much warmer. What is the likelihood that it can keep getting worse? Well, in the tree ring record, we have periods of very low total runoff in the basin that lasted 25 years. Now we're at 20 now. So this is not unprecedented and it could keep going. The universal body of climate science in the United States projects that it's going to get worse because in a warming climate, evapotranspiration rates increase. The duration of the growing season increases. Tree line moves higher, and the soils are bone dry. Here's how bad it is. Last year, the total peak snowpack in the Colorado River Basin was 85% of normal. Not a bad snow year. but the inflow to Lake Powell was 35% of normal. It all went into an exceptionally dry soil. The monsoons of this year have helped us out tremendously. But the body of science says that we're not in a drought that we're going to come out of. The body of science says it's going to keep getting even more difficult. It's not drought, it's aridification. The basin is drying out. So the law of the river is being renegotiated in little bits and is being renegotiated. And the world is a different place. Phoenix is now the 5th largest city in the United States. Yet, the law of the river is what was negotiated in the 1920s, and we are a nation of laws. I'm going to show 2 graphs, and this is time from the present out to 50 years, okay? And this is the total storage in Powell and Meade, okay? And this is if use in the upper basin increases and use in the lower basin drops so that the upper and the lower basin both use the same amount. That would allow the upper basin to increase its use by 33%, but there would have to be draconian decreases in the lower basin, and you tell me how that's even remotely possible. But on the other hand, this red line is if the lower basin continues to use all the water that it wants to, and the upper basin grows as it imagines and dreams. And this plot graph goes from 0 to 35. What's the total storage of Powell and Meade available to be stored? It's a number like 50. So the point is 25, that's only 50% full. So the top of this graph is, up at the top of the screen, right? But the point is there are very different outcomes. This one is surely not politically possible, even though the upper basin might imagine and dream it. And this is probably catastrophe. That means 2 reservoirs at times go into dead pool. So we looked at a whole bunch of combinations of decreasing lower basin storage, decreasing upper basin consumption, and said if you run that under the hydrology of the 21st century, under the hydrology of the millennial drought, what would the system stabilize at? And the point is, different political trade-offs lead to different sort of average possibilities for total storage in Meade and Powell. Okay? It just is to say, this is all going to be negotiated. Right now, in fact, right now, this minute, the House Natural Resources Subcommittee is having a hearing in Washington, D.C. on drought and response to drought. And right now, the commissioners of each of the basin states are testifying. For all I know, at this minute, Gene Shawcroft, representing the state of Utah, is testifying. So people are arguing, and right now it's a huge poker game. No, upper basin says, we cut a deal. We get to use as much as you. The lower basin says, no, we're using the water. You're dreaming of using the water. And we're in the highest stakes poker game you're ever going to find. I can't tell you how it's going to play out, but I can tell you that if you have an opinion, you ought to let people know. And this is that graph of temperatures, and these are different scenarios of what those temperatures might be, but what I would just say is we've modeled and looked at different ways to operate the system with different consumptive uses, means different storage amounts in the reservoirs, which means different water temperatures in the river and in different parts of the river. And what I'm going to tell you is that temperature is a huge ecosystem driver. And so the fate of the ecosystems of the river is directly tied back to the levels of consumptive use and whether it's used in the upper basin or the lower basin. And anybody who remembers the old days when Grand Canyon, Colorado River was cold, you're probably going to be telling those stories just like telling stories about water going over the top of the boulder at Boulder Narrows. And is that good or bad? Fish biologists have no clue, because the interactions between native and non-native species are extremely difficult to predict. Warmer waters are good for the growth of native fish. We've always wanted a warmer river because then humpback chub could spawn in the main stem. But that also helps the non-native species grow, and they eat and compete with the native species. And how that trade-off goes is extremely difficult. Warmer weather, warmer water temperatures, you can probably kiss the rainbow trout fishery below Glen Canyon goodbye. It's going to change and reduce the nutrients in the Colorado River. And right now, the Colorado River and Grand Canyon is phosphorus limited. So it could accentuate that. So there's a lot of trade-offs here. And most ecologists will say it's a scary, brave new world, and we're going to have to see. The dark colors are Lake Powell at minimum power pool or dead pool. And in light blue is at full pool. Powell would be a very different place. And as some of you know, there are waterfalls and rapids at the head of those reservoirs. In Lake Mead, there's about 240 feet of sediment between the present river channel and the old river channel. And the river, now that Mead has gone back down, has cut its way back down into these sediments, except that it didn't cut down in the same place, and that gives us Pierce Ferry Rapid. Right now, Pierce Ferry Rapid is unrunnable by undesirable non-native fish coming up into Western Grand Canyon. So right now, Western Grand Canyon is one of the best places in the world for a native fishery because the non-native competitors and predators can't get there. This is Paiute Falls and the San Juan arm of Lake Powell. It also is a complete block to upstream fish migration. I just have a few minutes. I'm sorry to be so depressing. This has been such a wonderful meeting of wonderful stories. Thank God I'm here and you've got 2 more hours to recover from this. I'm sorry. This is the old Colorado River at height. And this is the course of the present Colorado River at height. And this is the horrible boat ramp at North Wash. And the fear is that as Powell keeps going down and the river incisors, you're going to have an unrunnable waterfall at height. And yet, on the other hand, on Sunday, I'm lucky to go. I'm going to be going down through Cat with Mike Dehoff and the wonderful guys in Moab of the Returning Rapids Project to look at the return of a number of different rapids in the very upstream end right below the big drops. And there are people who look at this and and it's the catastrophe of the West. And there are other people who look at this and say, this is the greatest thing that ever happened. Again, we are a dysfunctional group on this long river trip that we've been on, but we're going to have to figure it out. And the one dilemma of the Returning Rapids project is that it's easy and fun to do this. It's an awesome trip. You go around the bend, you don't know what's there. The hard thing's going to be is when we do get the one wet year, and we will have a good wet year for sure, is that who amongst us doesn't think Powell's going to be filled immediately, or you're going to refill this as fast as possible. We are a complicated group on this river trip. And if people don't want this, and people want this water to be stored somewhere else, we got a hell of a lot of legwork and organizing to be done to get to that, because if it's business as usual, this goes underwater again. All right, this is great. Thank you. But yeah. So we have looked at the relative benefits. If you have if you're unlikely to fill these reservoirs, what are the merits of storing water in Mead or storing water in Powell? And there are trade-offs. And there's no perfect answer. Warmer water going into Mead means that cold aerated water doesn't plunge through Lake Mead, which degrades the quality of water withdrawn from the Southern Nevada Water Authority. Do you think they're going to want warm water and higher water treatment costs for Vegas? Do you think they're going to fight hard? You bet. If you have a different opinion, you better mention it. You better let somebody who matters know. But just know that there are trade-offs here. So this is a way to think about the run that we have to do through this unrunnable rapid. Unambiguously, a warming climate is decreasing watershed runoff. We have a lower supply. That's nature and the implications of loading the atmosphere with carbon. We're going to have to respond politically, and in the Colorado River system, the system's entirely dominated by the Colorado River Storage Project. So we have conscious political decisions to make. And those political decisions will necessitate changes in the rules of reservoir operations. And that will change. I've illustrated it with temperature and fragmentation of the watershed. We could do the same thing with sediment. Powell is so low, its hydropower revenues are down. Therefore, money going to the basin fund is critically low. And even though this year, for the first time in 3 years, we had a bumper crop of sand produced out of the Paria River, and we're positioned to have everything right to have a controlled flood, to rebuild beaches which are hammered by a big monsoon season, the flood was canceled. Why? Because they didn't want to risk any more loss of revenue, or drop Powell even a little bit, tiny bit more relative to the critically low conditions that Powell is at. So even these low conditions are adversely affecting the kind of management we've had in Grand Canyon that we're used to. And then the message is, this will lead to changes in flow regime, sediment supply, river temperature, that in turn are going to cause changes in river ecosystems, both vegetation and aquatic organisms. And probably the most important thing that we do not know is, for instance, if Powell goes really warm, is that a temporary, inconvenient jolt to a system that for 50 years has been cold, and the system recovers and goes back to what it was? Or is that an irreversible game changer? Is that an irreversible threshold change from which we're never going back? Because if that's what it is, and there's no changing it, and the basin water users say, sorry, we've got other agendas, then even the goals of the Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management Program are not robust to face what's going to happen in the future. So, which is only to, I gave a talk kind of like this to the Colorado River Water Conservation District, the ranchers and farmers of West Slope, Colorado, a week and a half ago. My main message to you is, I don't know what this run is. I'm not good enough to see what the run is, but we damn well are going to get through that run. And if you have an opinion It's not good enough to just complain about how the reclamation is incompetent and evil and what have you. You're going to have to make a difference the way the river guides and the tribes made a difference to get the Grand Canyon Protection Act passed, the way other legislation got passed. If you have an opinion, you got to figure a way to voice it. Thanks.